there is a name that refuses to stay in the past where history has tried to put it, not because the man who carried it commanded armies or shaped the laws of nations or built monuments that outlasted his century. He did none of those things. He held no seat in any parliament. He conquered no territory that any map could record with permanence. He was a pirate, operating in the early years of the 18th century for perhaps 2 years at the height of his power, commanding a few hundred men on stolen ships in waters that technically belonged to the British Empire. He was dead at 38. His body was thrown into Pamlico Sound, and 300 years later, his name is still the first one that anyone says. Blackbeard. There is something almost unreasonable about the staying power of those 2 syllables. Consider what they have outlasted. The British Empire that hunted him down, the colonial world whose commerce he terrorized, the naval officers who celebrated his death, the governors who wrote triumphant dispatches to London. Every institution, every force, every arm of official power that arrayed itself against Edward Teach in his short and extraordinary life has since passed into history's archives. His name remains above ground, still breathing, still carrying the original charge. He was not the wealthiest pirate of the Golden Age. Bartholomew Roberts took more prizes by a considerable margin. He was not the longest lived. Dozens of his contemporaries survived him by years. He was not even, by the cold arithmetic of ships taken and cargoes seized, the most productive. What he was. And this is the thing that changes everything, the thing that 3 centuries of storytelling has been circling without quite landing on, was the most complete, the most fully realized, the most deliberately, almost architecturally constructed figure of terror that the brief and brilliant era of Atlantic piracy produced. A man who understood something that most people who achieve power never understand at all, that what the world believes you are capable of is more dangerous than anything you have actually done. That fear, properly manufactured and carefully maintained, is the most renewable resource in the human landscape. He manufactured it brilliantly. Into his long black beard he twisted slow-burning hempen matches, the same kind used to fire cannon at sea, and lit them before boarding prizes, so that smoke drifted across features held deliberately wide-eyed and unblinking in the grey Atlantic dawn. He wore a bandolier of pistols across his chest. He stood 6 feet tall in an age when most English sailors stood 5.5. He had spent years learning, from the finest teacher in the trade, every technique of maritime intimidation available, and he applied them all simultaneously, and the result was something that the men who faced him could not categorize and therefore could not resist. He looked, they said, like a figure that had walked out of a sermon about the world's end. He meant to. Here is the thing the legend has obscured beneath 3 centuries of embellishment in all of the surviving records of his piracies. Every captain's deposition, every merchant's sworn complaint, every governor's furious dispatch to the Admiralty. There is no clear evidence that Edward Teach ever killed a single prisoner. Not one. The most feared man in the Western Atlantic, and his reputation for slaughter may have been, in the main, a fiction. His fiction, built deliberately, maintained with the precision of a man who understood that theater, in the right circumstances, was the deadliest weapon he could carry. That is the paradox at the center of this story, and it is what makes the story worth telling still. Because Blackbeard was not a criminal who got lucky with his timing. He was not a brute, elevated by circumstance into legend. He was a man of unusual intelligence, operating in a world that happened to be perfectly shaped for the particular kind of genius he possessed. Arriving at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right waters, with exactly the right understanding of what that moment required. He moved through it like a man who had been expecting it. In the peak months of his operation, he blockaded a city of the British Empire and walked away with what he demanded. He captured a French slave ship and transformed her into the most feared vessel in the Western Atlantic. He built a fleet, commanded hundreds of men, and made his name known from the fishing ports of New England to the counting houses of London. And he did it all on a budget of stolen goods and manufactured dread. And then a naval lieutenant came for him in the dark, and the battle that followed lasted perhaps 10 minutes, and it took 5 musket balls and approximately 20 sword wounds to put Edward Teach on the deck of an enemy ship and keep him there. His head was hung from the bowsprit. His body sank into Pamlico Sound. The legend did not follow it into the water. The legend stayed on the surface, where it has remained ever since, feeding, 3 centuries later, into every pirate flag ever flown, every pirate costume ever worn, every fictional pirate villain ever written. Robert Louis Stevenson drew from him. J.M. Barrie drew from him. Hollywood has never stopped drawing from him. The template he built on the deck of a stolen ship in the waters east of Martinique in the autumn of 1717 is still the template. Nothing has replaced it. Nothing has come close. To understand where it came from, to find the man behind the smoke, the boy before the beard, the world that made Edward Teach before Edward Teach remade himself. The story must begin at the beginning, not at Ocracoke where it ended, not aboard the Queen Anne's Revenge where it blazed brightest, but earlier and further in a city where every street smelled of the Atlantic and every window faced west, the world that made him, Bristol, war, and the education of Edward Teach. To find the boy who became Blackbeard, the historian must learn to navigate by what is not there. The parish registers, if they ever held his name, are lost or incomplete. The ship's logs that might have tracked his early service are gone. Even his surname is disputed. Teach, Thatch, Drummond. The variations suggesting a man who wore his identity loosely from the very beginning, as though he had already understood, long before it became professionally necessary, that a name was a costume, and costumes could be changed. He enters the historical record as a fully formed adult, already dangerous, already exceptional, already on his way to becoming something the world had no adequate language for. The inference, careful, evidence-based, assembled from the few certainties that later records allow, points to Bristol. In the last years of the 17th century, in a city that was, in every material sense, the edge of the known world, Bristol was the second city of England, second only to London in wealth, in ambition, in the particular restless energy of a place that has built its entire existence around being the gateway between one world and another. It sat where the River Avon pushed into the broader Severn estuary, and from there into the Bristol Channel, and from the Channel into the open Atlantic. And the Atlantic, in those years, was not simply an ocean. It was the future. The empire that controlled the Atlantic controlled what came next. And every man in Bristol understood this, the way a man understands weather, not as a theory, but as the permanent condition of his daily life. The tides were famous. Twice a day the water surged into the harbour with enough force to float a vessel off the mud it had rested upon at low water, and sailors universally condemned the harbour as the most inconvenient anchorage in England, and they returned to it season after season, because the inconvenience was a small price for the commerce. 3 trades drove Bristol. Sugar from the Caribbean, arriving in great hogsheads that gave the waterfront district its permanent sweetness. Tobacco from Virginia and the Carolinas, moving in both directions on the Atlantic current. And the third trade, the most profitable, and in the fullness of historical judgment, the most monstrous, which moved English manufactured goods to the African coast, African people to the American plantations, and American plantation goods back to Bristol in a circuit of suffering and enrichment that the city was too wealthy to examine too closely. This was the air of Bristol. This was what a boy breathed growing up in its lanes and along its wharves. His name was probably Edward. The other particulars are gone. What we can infer from the man he became is that the boy received some education, The adult. Teach was demonstrably literate in a class where literacy was not guaranteed, which implies a family of modest standing. A ship chandler's household, perhaps. A merchant's younger son. A craftsman with ambitions. Whatever the truth, the boy grew up within sight and sound and smell of the harbor, and he grew up watching ships. And, in Bristol, in the 1690s, a boy who watched ships long enough eventually found himself on one. The merchant marine was permanently short of hands. The privateering vessels that the great Bristol merchants outfitted in time of war were always in want of young bodies willing to climb and haul and endure. The legal minimum age for apprenticeship was 14, but this was a guideline rather than a rule, observed when convenient and ignored when it wasn't. Boys of 10 and 11 served on working vessels. Nobody who mattered noticed. What an apprenticeship at sea meant in those years was an education in the total vocabulary of hardship. A boy was sent aloft in gales because there was no one else available, and the sail needed furling, and the ship needed to keep moving. He learned rope splicing and sail handling and the reading of weather from the color of the horizon at dawn, and he learned these things through the only pedagogy the sea has ever offered. The immediate, sometimes fatal consequence of not knowing something at the moment you needed to know it. He was cold in winter and scorched in summer. He was hungry more often than not. He was beaten for slowness and praised for speed, and paid almost nothing for any of it. And the men around him who could not absorb this treatment washed out quickly, and the men who could absorb it emerged from the other side as something the land-bound world had no word for. The boys who survived became, by their 20s, the finest sailors alive, hardened in ways that did not advertise themselves, capable of things in half a gale that no landsman could approach in flat calm, possessed of a self-possession that came not from competence exactly, but from the specific, tested knowledge that they had already encountered the worst the world could produce and were still standing. Edward Teach survived his apprenticeship, more than survived. By every indication available, he was precisely the kind of young man who found hard environments clarifying rather than defeating. The sea was testing him and he was passing, and he knew it. And in that knowledge, in that early discovery that the thing breaking the people around him was not going to break him, something foundational was being built. Then came the war, and the war completed it. The War of the Spanish Succession, known in the American colonies as Queen Anne's War, ran from 1701 to 1740, and it touched the Atlantic world with the thoroughness of a conflict that is simultaneously a military campaign and a commercial disruption and a generation-defining event. In broad political terms, it was a European dispute over the Spanish crown. In practical terms, for the sailors of the English-speaking world, it was a decade of licensed violence at sea. England issued letters of marque to private captains, authorizing them to attack and seize the merchant vessels of France and Spain. These captains were called privateers. The ships they sailed were called privateers. The work was called privateering, and the law considered it entirely distinct from piracy. The distinction was a piece of paper. A privateer with a letter of marque in his coat was a servant of the crown. The same man without it was a pirate, subject to hanging. The ships were the same. The tactics were the same. The violence was the same. Only the authorization differed, and the authorization could be revoked, and everyone in the trade knew this, and everyone continued anyway, because the money was extraordinary, and the alternative was the merchant service. Teach served as a privateer almost certainly out of Jamaica, which was England's principal operational base for Caribbean privateering against the Spanish. The chronicler, Captain Charles Johnson, writing a decade after Teach's death, drawing on accounts from men who had sailed with him, recorded that Teach distinguished himself repeatedly in this service for what Johnson called uncommon boldness and personal courage. This is not a phrase Johnson used carelessly. It means something specific and significant. The man was notable. In a world full of men hardened by years of maritime combat, for the quality of what he was willing to do and the place he was willing to go to do it. He rose, not to command. Legitimate service had no mechanism for promoting a man of his background that fast, but through the working ranks, until he was the kind of experienced, trusted hand that captains kept close and consulted and watched. And then the war ended. The Treaty of Utrecht, signed in April of 1713 and supplemented by subsequent agreements over the following year, closed the hostilities with the administrative swiftness that treaties always manage. One day, a letter of marque was a valid legal document. The next day it was worthless paper. The ships were still there. The men were still there. The skills were still there, sharp and practiced, pointed in a single direction. There was simply no longer any legal context in which to deploy them. The numbers involved in this sudden unemployment were not small. Historians estimate that 40,000 men or more had been engaged in the various forms of English maritime violence the war had sustained. The Royal Navy paid off the majority of its crews within 2 years. The merchant marine contracted as fast as it had grown. The privateering commissions were void the moment the ink dried on the treaty. For Edward Teach, skilled in a single trade, accustomed to the economics of prize-taking, with no other profession and no alternative horizon, this was not a disappointment. It was a wall. The harbors of the Caribbean filled, in the years after Utrecht, with men who had run out of legal options but had not run out of energy or capability, or the seasoned confidence of people who had been doing dangerous things successfully for a decade. They gathered in the ports, drinking down the last of their prize money, watching their ships rot at anchor, looking at the wide open water. They did the obvious arithmetic. The arithmetic pointed to Nassau. The island of New Providence in the Bahamas had, in the years immediately following the war, become something without any real precedent in the English-speaking world. The colonial authority had collapsed. The proprietary lords who held nominal title to the Bahamas had given up administering them from a distance. The fort at Nassau was in ruins, the garrison non-existent, the official presence of the crown reduced to memory. And into this vacancy, with the purposeful efficiency of people who recognize opportunity without being told to look for it, came several hundred former privateers who had concluded that the war had ended. But they had not. By 1715, Nassau Harbor was a pirate republic. They called themselves the Brethren of the Coast. 200 to 300 men lived there permanently, swelling to 1,000 or more at the height of the season. They had patched enough of the old fort to fly a flag. They careened their ships on the beach and refitted in the harbor, and went out and came back with prizes, and went out again in a cycle that had the rhythm of an industry rather than a crime spree. They held councils. They elected officers and captains and quartermasters according to written articles that specified each man's share of the proceeds, with a precision that would not have looked out of place in a modern partnership agreement. They governed themselves after a fashion, democratically, brutally, with the specific justice of men who had spent years watching the official world's justice applied exclusively against people like them. Historians have come to call this period the Republic of Pirates, and the name is not entirely romantic exaggeration. Within Nassau, the men who had been the most economically marginal workers in the Atlantic world had assembled something that looked, from a certain angle, like an alternative to the society that had discarded them. To understand why Edward Teach arrived at Nassau and stayed, to understand why men of ability and experience who had other options still chose the trade, requires a moment with the arithmetic. Consider what the alternatives were. The Royal Navy paid badly, fed worse, and disciplined its crews with a violence that even the hardened standards of the age found notable. Flogging was routine. Disease aboard a man of war killed more men than enemy action by a wide margin. The food was monotonous to the edge of madness. A man who completed a 5-year commission received pay calculated to last him a fortnight if he was careful, after the Navy's various deductions for slops and breakage had been subtracted. The merchant service was worse in some respects. A merchant captain was a small tyrant, with no admiralty board to appeal to, and no naval discipline to check him. The wages were lower than the Navy's, the conditions comparable, and a sailor who complained could be put ashore in any port on earth with nothing but his grievance for company. A pirate, by contrast, lived under one of the most egalitarian working arrangements then existing anywhere in the European world. The articles, signed by every man before a voyage, specified the division of proceeds with clarity and fairness. The captain received 2 shares where the common sailor received 1, and the officers received proportions between. A man who lost an eye in action received a compensatory payment from the common fund. A man who lost a hand received more. The food, taken from captured vessels, was often better than anything a naval cook could produce. The work, in the intervals between raids, was lighter. The latitude to complain was genuine, because a captain who made himself intolerable could be voted out, and this happened regularly. There was a saying among the men of the trade, recorded in several surviving depositions, that has come down in various forms but with a consistent meaning: in honest service, thin commons and hard labor; in this trade, plenty and liberty and ease. The choice, to the men making it, was not close. Teach arrived at Nassau in approximately 1716, perhaps 35 years old, and he found waiting for him in the harbor the man who would complete his education. Benjamin Hornigold. Hornigold is one of the most consequential and least celebrated figures in the history of Atlantic piracy, and the reason for both his consequence and his obscurity is the same. He was the teacher, not the student. He was the man who built the thing, not the thing itself. His pupil's fame consumed him so completely that he is remembered now primarily as the man who trained Blackbeard, which is a little like being remembered as the man who showed Alexander the Great which end of a sword to hold. He was considerably more than that. A former privateer like Teach, Hornigold had settled at Nassau and built his operation with a methodical patience that set him apart from the more impulsive captains around him. He preferred, when possible, to take prizes without bloodshed, closing on a vessel fast, displaying overwhelming force, and waiting for the merchant captain's arithmetic to arrive at the same conclusion it always arrived at. He maintained a peculiar personal rule against attacking English ships, which his crew tolerated and eventually grew tired of tolerating. He conserved resources. He thought in seasons. He was a professional in a trade that attracted many amateurs, and he saw in Teach the raw material of something exceptional. What Hornigold taught was not primarily the violence. Teach already knew the violence. What Hornigold taught was the intelligence, the careful gathering of information about shipping routes and cargo manifests, and which captains were brave and which were not, and which waters were watched by naval patrols and which were not. He taught the management of small, fast vessels in the shallow coastal waters, where heavier ships of the line could not follow. He taught the economies of the trade and the management of men who had agreed to follow you today and reserve the right to reconsider tomorrow. And he taught the theater. This is perhaps Hornigold's most enduring contribution, not articulated as such, not deliberately passed on as a formal lesson, but absorbed by an apprentice who was watching with the close attention of someone who understood that what he was seeing was important. The ideal pirate engagement, as Hornigold practiced it, was one in which no shot was fired, in which the approaching flag, the crowded deck, the captain's bearing, the accumulated weight of reputation, produced a surrender before the combat could begin. Every element of the encounter was a signal. The signals had to be calibrated. The calibration required understanding your audience with a depth that most men never bothered to develop. Teach watched. He learned. He began to understand that this was a craft, that the appearance of invincibility was something that could be constructed, piece by deliberate piece, with the patience of a man building something intended to last. The thing he would eventually build would outlast everything around it. By early 1707, Hornigold had reached a conclusion about his apprentice. The conclusion was simple. The man was ready. He had taken a small sloop as a prize in a recent cruise, and he turned her over to Teach without ceremony, and Edward Teach had his first command. He sailed her out of Nassau in company with Hornigold's vessel, and the Atlantic received them, and the last chapter of the education was underway. The first command, when the apprentice became the captain. The first thing a new captain learns is that command is heavier than it looks from below. The deck of a small sloop is not a large space, 60 feet or so from stem to stern, perhaps 20 across the beam. A crew of 70 dangerous men, when assembled upon it, has nowhere private to go. The captain stands at the quarterdeck, 6 paces from the wheel, visible to everyone. And from that small elevation he must run a ship and a fighting company and a small floating economy and, more than any of these things, a parliament of men who have agreed, provisionally and revocably, to follow him. This was what Teach inherited in the early summer of 1707. The sloop Hornigold gave him carried perhaps 6 guns and a crew of 70, drawn partly from Hornigold's own company, and partly from the men who had attached themselves to the new venture in Nassau. She was fast on the wind and could be put about quickly. She was a small ship by the standards of legitimate commerce. She was exactly the right ship for the business Teach intended to pursue. He sailed her north with Hornigold toward the American mainland, and he held command for the first time, and he felt the difference immediately. The difference was not the authority. The difference was the exposure. A pirate captain's authority was not granted by any institution. It was not conferred by rank or title or the endorsement of a crown. It was earned, continuously, in the judgment of the men who had chosen to follow him, and who retained the right to unchoose at any moment. The articles that governed a pirate company, signed by every man before the voyage began, were explicit on this point. The captain commanded in action, in chase, in the violent moments where delay cost lives. In all other matters the company decided. The captain held one vote, like anyone else, and a captain who did not deliver, who brought back empty holes, who lost men unnecessarily, who proved indecisive when decision was everything, was removed, not metaphorically, actually. A vote was taken on his own deck, in front of his own crew, and he was returned to the forecastle and a new captain elected in his place. This happened constantly in Nassau. The records of the period are full of deposed captains, men who had commanded fine ships on Monday and were common sailors by Wednesday, and the knowledge of this was the permanent condition under which every captain in the trade operated. Teach understood it. He had watched it happen to other men. He had no intention of allowing it to happen to him. The early cruises were methodical. Hornigold set the course and chose the hunting grounds, the Virginia Capes, where merchant vessels bound for the Chesapeake threaded the long approach to the bay, the Delaware approaches, where the Philadelphia trade passed through narrow water, the latitude where ships from Madeira crossed toward the American coast, reliable and rich. Teach handled his own ship, managed his own actions, divided his own proceeds. The larger direction of the cruise remained in Hornigold's hands. This was, in fact, precisely what Teach needed: the independent command, without the full independent responsibility. The chance to discover, in real conditions, the specific texture of what he had been training for. The prizes came regularly and without drama. A sloop out of Havana carrying flour, useful but not lucrative. A Bermudian vessel with wine and spirits, which the crew regarded as considerably more agreeable. A Madeiran ship carrying 100 pipes of wine, taken in the open Atlantic and worth real money at colonial prices. Across the summer, perhaps a dozen vessels of various descriptions, all of them surrendering after the briefest demonstration of force, all of their crews released to tell the story. And the story was what mattered, not the cargoes. The story. Every merchant captain who returned to port with an account of having been taken this many guns, this many men, a captain of such and such description, was contributing to the accumulating reputation that was Teach's most valuable asset and his only durable one. The cargo spoiled. The coins were spent. The reputation grew. Teach was managing it consciously, even at this early stage. The conduct of his actions was controlled in a way that suggested deliberate calculation, force sufficient to produce the desired outcome, no more. Prisoners treated with a roughness that would be remembered, but not a cruelty that would harden future resistance. The theater of menace without the substance of massacre. He was building something. He knew what he was building. He did not yet have the ship or the name that would allow him to build it at full scale. Both were coming. In the early autumn of 1717, the two pirate vessels cruising off the Carolina coast came upon a sight that neither Hornigold nor Teach had encountered quite in this form before. She was a 60-ton sloop named the Revenge, mounting 10 guns, commanded by a man named Stede Bonnet. Major Stede Bonnet of Barbados was, to place it plainly, not a pirate of the recognizable kind. He was a retired militia officer, a wealthy sugar planter, the owner of substantial land and the father of a respectable family. He had purchased the Revenge, purchased her with his own money, an act so eccentric in the context of the trade that it was remarked upon by contemporaries as evidence of some disorder of the normal faculties, outfitted her at personal expense, recruited a crew from the Barbados waterfront, and sailed forth into a career of piracy that he appeared to have chosen in the same spirit that a man of comfortable middle age might choose, say, to learn a new language or take up an unusual hobby. The hobby had not gone well. He had no seamanship. He had no experience of command. His crew regarded him with a compound of pity and contempt that they had not yet found a way to fully express. He had taken a few minor prizes in the spring and summer, and then he had encountered a Spanish man-of-war off the Florida coast, and the encounter had left him wounded, his crew depleted, and the Revenge limping northward in a state that was not quite sinking but was making no claims to the contrary. When Teach and Hornigold found him, Bonnet could not stand from his bunk. What happened next was, in the gentlest reading the record allows, a corporate acquisition. Hornigold and Teach offered assistance. The offer, under the circumstances, was difficult to refuse. Bonnet was carried into the cabin of the pirate consort and installed as a comfortable convalescent, and the practical command of the Revenge was assumed by Teach. From that autumn forward, the Revenge sailed with her 10 guns added to Teach's 6, and Bonnet occupied his cabin and read. He was, by all accounts, an enthusiastic reader, while the man nominally serving under him ran his ship, managed his crew, and made the strategic decisions that Bonnet had been making badly for months. Teach had acquired a second ship without firing a shot. He had done it while maintaining, with careful political intelligence, the fiction that Bonnet remained the Revenge's captain. A fiction that cost him nothing and protected him from the accusation of having seized a fellow pirate's vessel outright. It was the first unmistakably sophisticated political move of his career. It would not be the last. The partnership with Hornigold dissolved in the winter of 1717. The cause was Hornigold's scruple against attacking English vessels, a personal code that his crew had tolerated across many profitable seasons and had finally grown tired of tolerating. They voted him out. He went quietly, retained command of a smaller boat, and within months would accept the royal pardon that the new Bahamian governor was offering to pirates willing to renounce the trade. Hornigold would end his career hunting former colleagues on behalf of the same crown he had spent years robbing. which was an ironic conclusion but a reasonable one for a careful man who had always understood the industry's long-term economics. Teach took none of those lessons. He had no interest in pardons. He had spent a year and a half learning the trade from the finest practitioner he had encountered, and he was only now beginning to understand what that education had prepared him for. He had 2 ships. He had perhaps 150 men. He had a reputation that was growing in the direction he intended. He had a partner in Stede Bonnet who was useful to have and impossible to resent, and cost him nothing in practice. And he had, somewhere ahead in the winter waters of the Eastern Caribbean, an appointment with a French slave ship that would change everything. He did not know this yet. He was simply sailing. That was about to be enough. The making of a legend, 5 acts of a man becoming a myth. In late November of 1717, in the waters east of the island of Martinique, Edward Teach did the thing that made him Blackbeard. Not the beard, not the matches. Those came after. What he did first was capture a ship. She was called La Concorde des Nantes, French, 3-masted and deep-keeled, more than 200 tons, armed with 14 guns and crewed by some 75 men at the ragged end of the Atlantic crossing from West Africa, carrying in her lower decks perhaps 500 enslaved people, and in her captain, a man named Francois Dosset, who understood, when the 2 pirate vessels came at him with 150 men flying a black flag, exactly what was happening and exactly what his options were. He struck his colors after a token exchange. La Concorde was a prize. What Teach did with her next was the act of a man who had, in some fundamental way, changed register. He did not sell her. He did not strip her and burn her, which was the common fate of prizes too large to be practically sailed with a pirate crew. He kept her. He transferred the French crew and the enslaved cargo into smaller vessels and sent them toward Martinique. He turned his own men loose on her interior with tools and timber and intention, and in the days that followed he transformed her. The 14 guns became 40. The slave ship became a warship, and the warship received a new name. He called her the Queen Anne's Revenge. Consider the name. Sit with it a moment. Queen Anne had been dead for 3 years. Her war. The war that had made privateers of a generation of English sailors, and then made pirates of those same men when the treaties were signed and the commissions were void, had ended 4 years before that. In naming his ship after a dead queen's dead war, Teach was not being sentimental. He was making a declaration. He was the war's unresolved consequence. He was what happened when an empire wages a decade of maritime violence, and then simply tells the men who fought it to go home and find other work. He was the bill that Utrecht had failed to pay. The Queen Anne's Revenge with 40 guns was, in the waters of the Western Atlantic, a naval force comparable to anything the colonial governors of America could put against her. She could not be outrun by a merchant vessel. She could not be outgunned by a colonial patrol boat. In the right hands, she could do very nearly anything she chose. And now came the beard. The beard itself was real, long, black, extraordinarily thick, grown to a length that reached nearly to his chest. The kind of feature that men noticed before they had registered anything else about him, the kind that imposed itself on memory without asking permission. He had, by this point, developed the habit of twisting it into cords and tying them off with ribbon, so that it framed his face in a way that was, in ordinary daylight, already extraordinary. Ordinary daylight was not the theater he was designing. Into those twisted cords he wove slow-burning hempen matches, the same matches used throughout the age of sail to fire cannon, treated with saltpeter so they would smolder for hours without igniting fully or dying out. Before boarding a prize, before placing himself before any audience of frightened men, he would light them. The smoke wreathed his head. It drifted across features he had trained himself to hold entirely still, wide-eyed, unblinking, fixed on the middle distance with the expression of a man who was somewhere else entirely, somewhere that had no concern with the ordinary categories of mercy and consequence that governed the behavior of merely human beings. He added a bandolier of pistols across his chest, 3 pairs in leather holsters, a sword at his hip and a knife at his belt. He was 6 feet tall and built in proportion, and the result, in the half-light of an early morning encounter, in the swirling smoke of a brief gun action, in any of the atmospheric conditions that the Atlantic reliably provided, was something that the men who faced him could not categorize and therefore could not resist. He appeared, quite simply, to be on fire. He appeared to have come from somewhere below the world. He meant to appear exactly this way. He had thought about it. He had constructed it. He had understood, with a clarity of psychological insight, that his upbringing cannot fully account for, that the human mind confronted with something it cannot categorize reaches automatically for its worst fears. A large and violent man is frightening. A large and violent man who appears to carry the infernal regions about his person is frightening beyond the reach of reason. The merchant captain who watched that figure cross toward him through the gun smoke did not see a man from Bristol who had learned his trade in Queen Anne's War. He saw a text he had memorized in childhood. He saw the end of something. The slow matches in his beard were not a costume. They were a weapon. In the full accounting of his career, they may have been the most effective weapon he ever carried. Among his own men, the effect was different, but equally important. A pirate crew's confidence was drawn substantially from the reputation of the captain they sailed under. They knew what they looked like from the outside. They knew the stories circulating in the ports. When they closed on a prize and watched the opposing crew's faces change at the sight of their captain emerging from the gun smoke, that change of expression was their shield as much as his. They were not merely pirates. They were Blackbeard's men. The distinction was operational. It made their enemies surrender faster, which kept them alive longer, which was the point of the whole enterprise. Fear, in the pirate world, was the most renewable resource available, and Teach had learned to mint it. The grand cruise, with the Queen Anne's Revenge as his flagship, Teach built. Through the early months of 1718, with Hornigold gone and Stay Bonnet nominally captaining the Revenge from the comfort of his reading cabin, Teach assembled around him a small fleet, 4 vessels in total, perhaps 400 men across the company. No colonial power in America commanded a comparable force afloat. The fleet swept through the Caribbean and then up the American coastline in a cruise that bore the hallmarks of a military campaign rather than simple opportunistic raiding. He took prizes methodically. He kept his men fed and paid and believing, which was the foundation and the architecture and the roof of everything. He moved with the deliberate velocity of a man who understood that motion was protection, that a target that did not stay still long enough to be properly identified could not be properly hunted. Across the spring of 1718, his name was in every colonial port from Barbados to Boston. Not always accurate in its details, not always precise in its geography or its chronology, but always accompanied by the same description. The beard, the smoke, the pistols, the size. The legend was spreading faster than the man, which was, of course, exactly as he intended, the blockade of Charleston. In May of 1718, he chose to demonstrate what he had built. The city of Charleston, South Carolina, was the most important port in colonial America south of Philadelphia. It was the gateway to the Carolina Low Country's vast rice and indigo economy. Its harbor moved dozens of ships weekly in the height of the season. Its merchants were among the wealthiest in the colonies. Its governor answered directly to London, and London answered to a king whose navy was supposed to rule the Atlantic world. Teach blockaded it for 8 days. He positioned the Queen Anne's Revenge and her consorts across the harbor approaches. in the deep water beyond the bar, and he simply waited. Ships that were trying to enter could not enter. Ships that were inside could not leave. In the course of 8 days, he took 8 or 9 vessels, accounts vary slightly, and held their passengers and crews aboard his ships as surety. Among those passengers were several members of the colony's most prominent families and at least one sitting member of the colonial council. He sent ashore a demand: not gold, not silver, not the release of any imprisoned associate. He demanded a chest of medicine, specifically the compounds used for the treatment of syphilis, which had made considerable inroads into his crew during their months at sea and in Caribbean ports. The audacity of this demand was understood perfectly by the citizens of Charleston. A pirate had closed the most important port on the American South, seized their neighbors, and sent a messenger ashore asking for medicine. Governor Robert Johnson had no practical means of breaking the blockade by force. He had seen what was riding at anchor in his harbor approaches, and he was not without a realistic grasp of arithmetic. He sent the medicine. Teach received it. He released the hostages, stripped of their valuables but physically intact, and he weighed anchor and sailed north. The fury that this produced in the subsequent correspondence, in the governor's dispatches, in the Merchants' Association letters, in the Admiralty offices on both sides of the Atlantic, was the fury of men who had understood, for the first time, precisely what they were dealing with. A single man, without any governmental authority whatsoever, had held a city of the British Empire hostage and had walked away with what he asked for. It was the high water mark of his power, and he knew it. The Beaufort Inlet grounding. Within weeks of Charleston, something happened at Topsail Inlet off the Carolina coast that has puzzled historians for 3 centuries, and probably always will. The Queen Anne's Revenge ran aground. She struck a shoal and settled, and could not be freed. A second vessel, the Adventure, grounding herself in the attempt to assist, was lost with her. 2 of Teach's 4 ships, the 2 largest, were suddenly gone. The case for accident is straightforward. The Carolina coastline is treacherous. The channels shift with every significant storm. Navigational errors happen. The case for design is more interesting. Teach was a master navigator. He had been working these waters for the better part of 2 years. A pilot of his experience would have sounded the approach before committing a vessel of the Queen Anne's Revenge's draft to a shallow inlet, and what followed the grounding strongly suggests that, if misfortune was involved, he was remarkably swift to profit from it. In the days immediately following, he quietly transferred the best of his accumulated plunder to the one remaining sound sloop. He marooned a substantial portion of his crew, including the long-enduring Stede Bonnet, whose comfortable captaincy of the Revenge Teach had been maintaining as a polite fiction for 8 months, on a sandy spit, with provisions sufficient to survive until rescue. He then sailed north to Bath, North Carolina, presented himself to the colonial governor Charles Eden, and applied for the royal pardon that Parliament had extended to any pirate willing to renounce the trade. Eden granted it without apparent difficulty. What the Beaufort grounding represented, accident or design, was the work of a man thinking several moves ahead. A fleet of 400 men required enormous quantities of prize goods merely to be kept satisfied. A large fleet attracted naval attention proportional to its size. A smaller, tighter operation, run from a protected colonial harbor by a governor with reasons of his own to look the other way, was in every practical sense a more sustainable proposition. He had made himself small again, deliberately, with his best plunder intact, in a colony whose governor was not going to ask inconvenient questions. The pardon, of course, did not hold. It rarely does, for men of Teach's constitution. The operations of this final period were conducted with a brazenness that, viewed in retrospect, looks almost like provocation. He took a French merchant vessel and brought her openly into the harbour at Bath. The colony's secretary, Tobias Knight, assisted in distributing the cargo to buyers who found it unnecessary to inquire about its origins. Governor Eden reviewed whatever documentation Teach provided and asked no further questions. He used Ocracoke Inlet as his operational base, its shallow approaches making it inaccessible to the heavier naval vessels that any serious pursuit would require, its remoteness providing privacy that the harbour at Nassau had long since lost. He was operating, in essence, in plain sight, under the protection of the colonial government, with the confidence of a man who had survived everything the world had thrown at him, and had arrived at the reasonable conclusion that it was going to keep on not killing him. And then, in the late summer of 1718, he hosted the gathering. Charles Vane came to Ocracoke. Others of the Brotherhood came. Teach received them all on the beach, and for several days and nights the fires burned long, and the rum moved from hand to hand, and the sound of it carried across the water in all directions. A celebration that must have seemed, to anyone watching from the tree line, like something between a feast and a declaration. Men who had made themselves the terror of the Western Ocean gathered in the Carolina dark, drinking together in the amber light of their own fires. They did not know it was the last gathering of its kind, the last night of the Golden Age, though the night stretched across several days, as the best nights sometimes do. They did not know what was being organized in the colony of Virginia by a man who had been watching all of this with a fury months in the making. The fires on the beach burned on. Blackbeard sat at their center, large and present and certain, the smoke rising around him as it always had, the laughter of his men in the darkness, the whole open Atlantic behind him. He was at the height of what he had made of himself, and the tide was already turning, the last tide, the Battle of Ocracoke, the death of a legend, and what he left behind. In the colony of Virginia, in the autumn of 1718, Governor Alexander Spotswood had arrived at the end of his patience. He had watched, across the preceding months, as the situation in North Carolina mounted to a provocation he could no longer treat as someone else's problem. The pardon taken and discarded, the open arrangement between Teach and the North Carolinian authorities, the Ocracoke gathering, which his informants had described with enough detail to make the picture clear, pirates operating almost in public under the protection of a neighboring colony's government within 2 days' sail of Virginia's coastline. Spotswood acted. In the strict legal sense, he had no authority to do so. Ocracoke Inlet lay in North Carolina's jurisdiction, and colonial governors had no standing to conduct military operations in one another's territory without consent. Spotswood did not seek consent. He hired 2 small sloops, shallow enough to work the Ocracoke waters, from private citizens of Virginia, and he commissioned a naval lieutenant named Robert Maynard to take them south and end the thing that had been going on for too long in the Carolina Sounds. Maynard was not a famous man. He was a lieutenant of the Royal Navy, steady, competent, entirely without theatrical pretension. He understood his orders. He had no interest in performing anything. He simply intended to do what he had been sent to do, which was the qualities Spotswood needed most. He departed the James River on the 17th of November, 1718, with the Jane and the Ranger and 60 men between them. His vessels carried no cannon. The Ocracoke shoals were too shallow to permit the weight. Maynard's men would fight, if it came to it, with pistols and muskets and cutlasses, and the specific kind of courage that comes from going into confined, close, ugly work without illusions about what it involves. It came to it. The night of the 21st of November, 1718, was the last night Edward Teach spent alive. He was anchored in the inlet aboard the sloop Adventure with perhaps 19 men, the rest of the company ashore on the island, recovering from the preceding days. He spent the evening drinking, heavily by the accounts that survive. Whether he knew what was coming, whether some instinct acquired across a decade of maritime predation was sending signals his conscious mind was declining to process, the sources do not agree. One of the men with him that night survived and gave his account later. He recalled that someone asked Teach at some point in the long evening whether anyone aboard knew where his money was hidden should the worst happen. Teach looked at the man. Then he said that nobody but himself and the devil knew where it was, and the longest liver should take it all. He went to sleep before midnight. Maynard's sloops were already moving south through the darkness, sounding carefully as they went. Dawn came grey and still over Ocracoke, the water flat and colourless, the marsh grass motionless. Teach was on his deck before full light. Whether awakened by the lookout or by something older than habit, the accounts don't specify. What he saw when he looked north was two small sloops working toward him through the shoal water. He knew what they were. He had time to run. He knew the inlet's channels better than any pilot Maynard had on board. He could have cut his cable and been in open water in minutes, and Maynard's sloops, heavier, slower, carrying 60 men to his 19, might not have closed him before dark. He did not run. He prepared his ship. He lit the matches in his beard. He waited. When Maynard was close enough to hail, words were exchanged across the water. The accounts differ on the precise language, but the substance is consistent. Maynard identified himself and his commission. Teach identified himself by the quality of his response, which was profanity and defiance, and the order to his gunner. The broadside was devastating. Maynard's Jane lost men in a single pass. The Ranger was hit so hard that her commander was wounded and her fighting capacity crippled. For a moment, looking at the carnage his guns had produced, Teach could reasonably have read the morning as settled in his favor. What he could not see was that Maynard had ordered his surviving men below decks. The Jane drifted toward the Adventure looking empty, her wheel unmanned, her deck bare. She had the appearance, at 50 yards through gun smoke and early morning light, of a vessel that had been reduced in the exchange to something less than useful. Teach brought the Adventure alongside. His men came over the rail armed and expecting to find a ship already beaten. What they found was 60 men coming up from below. The fighting lasted perhaps 10 minutes. 10 minutes of close, brutal, airless combat on the deck of a small sloop in a North Carolina inlet, with no room for tactics and no space for strategy, and nothing available but the specific will of each individual man to outlast the man immediately in front of him. Teach fought at the center of it, as he had always placed himself at the center of whatever was happening. He was shot, once and then again. He kept fighting. His men fell around him, and he kept fighting. He and Maynard engaged directly, and Maynard shot him, and could not stop him. Another man cut him across the neck with a sword, and could not stop him. He had absorbed, by the time his body finally registered a limit, 5 musket balls and wounds that the men who examined him afterward counted at somewhere between 20 and 25 in total. Then, quite suddenly, he was finished. The accounts differ on the exact mechanism. The most consistent version holds that he was in the act of cocking a pistol when the blood loss that should have stopped him, an unknowable number of wounds ago, finally completed its argument. He stopped. He went to the deck, and the fighting around him, which had been sustained by some principle that only he could supply, stopped with him. Robert Maynard cut off his head and hung it from the bowsprit of the Jane. The body was thrown into Pamlico Sound. The legend, because of course there is a legend, holds that the headless body swam 3 times around the ship before it sank. It did not, in any literal sense, do this, but the image has persisted for 300 years. which is its own kind of evidence about what the man had come to mean. The impact of Blackbeard's death was felt from Boston to London with a swiftness that speaks to how far the name had traveled. In the months that followed, the golden age of piracy collapsed with a speed that looks, in retrospect, almost coordinated. Woodes Rogers had arrived in Nassau in the summer of 1718 with a royal pardon in one hand and a noose in the other, and the Republic of Pirates had begun to fracture. Charles Vane, who had shared the Ocracoke fire with Teach only months before, was captured in 1720 and hanged at Port Royal. Calico Jack Rackham followed him to the same gallows the same year. Bartholomew Roberts, the most prolific prize-taker of the era, was killed in action off the coast of West Africa in 1722. By 1726, the Golden Age was over. The colonial governors were cooperating with one another. The Royal Navy was present in strength. The trade had become, in practical terms, unworkable. But the ending of the age was not Blackbeard's only legacy. Not even his most important one. The British government, in its official response to the piracy crisis that Teach's career more than any other had crystallized into an emergency requiring action, enacted policies that reshaped the Atlantic world. The Piracy Act, the establishment of dedicated naval squadrons on the American station, the revocation of the proprietary governance of the Bahamas, and its replacement with a royal administration backed by military force. These were the direct legislative consequences of a problem that Blackbeard's career had made impossible to continue ignoring. He changed maritime law. He reshaped colonial governance. He altered the deployment of the Royal Navy in the Western Atlantic. He did all of this without a title, without a commission, without a country, without anything but a ship and a name, and an extraordinary understanding of how fear moves through the world. In 1724, Captain Charles Johnson published his general history of the pirates, and the chapter on Blackbeard became the template through which every subsequent generation understood the Golden Age. The smoking beard, the hell-born appearance, the democratic ship's articles, the buried treasure that no one ever found, all of it passed from Johnson's pages into the collective imagination of the English-speaking world, and from there into Robert Louis Stevenson, who read it or read its echoes and constructed Long John Silver, into J.M. Barrie, who built Captain Hook, into 100 novelists and screenwriters and storytellers who followed after, every one of them drawing, consciously or not, on the template that one man assembled with extraordinary deliberateness on the quarterdeck of a stolen ship in the autumn of 1717, the skull and crossbones, the black flag, the fearsome captain who appears before you through the gun smoke like something from a bad dream. These were not inevitable features of how the world imagines piracy. They were choices, made by one man, refined through one career. And they have never been replaced. In 1996, a research team found the Queen Anne's Revenge. She lay in approximately 20 feet of water off Beaufort, North Carolina, her guns still in rough position, a material history preserved in the silt of 3 centuries. The excavations that followed have yielded cannon and shot, surgical instruments, navigational tools, personal objects. She is a state archaeological site. She is as close as history comes to the physical presence of the man who commanded her. There is a place on Ocracoke Island that the local people have always called Teach's Hole. It is the channel where the Adventure lay at anchor on the night of the 21st of November, 1718. In the early morning, when the light is grey and the air is still and the water carries that particular salt-heavy quiet that sailors have always learned to read with care, it is possible to stand at the edge of it and understand something about why the story has never quite been finished. Edward Teach operated at peak force for perhaps 2 years. He commanded a few hundred men. He held one city hostage for 8 days. He never, so far as the records show, killed a prisoner. He died fighting on the deck of an enemy ship at 38 years old. 5 musket balls in him and 20 cuts of the sword. And 3 centuries later, every child who has ever drawn a skull and crossbones, every writer who has ever reached for a pirate to stand at the bow of a black-sailed ship, every storyteller who has ever needed a figure that exists precisely at the boundary between the human and the terrifying, every one of them, knowing it or not, is drawing from the template that one man constructed, piece by deliberate piece, in the smoke-drifted mornings of the Atlantic world. He set out to become the thing the world would not forget. He was more successful than anyone who tried to stop him. He became the name. He became the smoke. He became, in the end, the figure standing at the edge of every pirate story ever told, unmoving, unhurried, looking across the water at whatever comes next. 300 years. The smoke has never cleared.